The clock above the bar ticked toward noon, but the place already pulsed with noise. Laughter bounced off the wooden walls, beer glasses clinked. The jukebox fought against shouts, and the smell of fried bacon and stale whiskey filled the air. The crowd wasn't the usual quiet lunch bunch. It was a gathering of bikers, leather jackets shining with patches, chains clanking as they moved. They had roared into town like thunderclouds, and the regulars kept their heads down, afraid of becoming targets. At the center of this storm was Raven, their leader, a tall man with tattoos running up his neck and a scowl that could shatter glass. He barked orders, slammed fists on the table, and demanded respect that nobody dared refuse. Behind the counter worked a young waitress named Maren. She was in her early 20s, her face pale but kind, her long chestnut hair tied back in a messy bun. Everyone in town knew her for her patience, never losing her cool, even when life seemed determined to push her down. She worked double shifts most days, her eyes always shadowed with fatigue, but she never complained. Rumors whispered through town that she was saving money for something important, but no one knew exactly what. What they did know was that Maren carried herself with a quiet dignity, like someone who had survived more than she ever told. That afternoon, when the bikers crowded the bar, she moved quickly between tables, balancing trays heavy with greasy plates. She avoided their lingering stares, their cruel jokes, and their loud demands. But when she reached Raven's table, she felt the air shift. His eyes narrowed on her like a predator watching prey. He ordered another round in a voice that left no room for delay. Then, as she set the drinks down, he smirked at his friends and said words that made her heart sink. "Bet she's hiding something under that prim little shirt." He sneered, his voice sharp enough to cut the air. The men laughed, the sound ugly and echoing. Maren's hands shook as she turned away, but Raven wasn't finished. In one quick, brutal motion, he reached out and grabbed the collar of her shirt. With a sudden jerk, the fabric tore, the sound slicing through the room like thunder. The bar went silent in an instant, music cutting off mid-beat, laughter dying on tongues. Every eye turned to her, and what they saw froze them. Across her chest, running from her collarbone down toward her ribs, were scars. Deep, uneven, and unmistakable. Some were burns, twisted and cruel. Others were long, thin lines that told stories of knives or belts. The scars weren't old enough to be forgotten, but not fresh enough to still bleed. They were the map of someone's survival written into her very skin. For a moment, nobody moved. The biker's sneers faltered. Raven's hand dropped, his face paling with shock. The regulars looked at her with wide eyes, and even the air seemed to hold its breath. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the strength it takes to rise after being broken, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Kindness Journal so we can keep spreading stories that remind the world of compassion. Now, let's return to Maren's story. The silence was heavier than any roar of engines. Maren stood there, clutching the torn edges of her shirt, her breathing ragged but her chin lifted. Shame burned in her cheeks, but beneath it was something stronger. She had spent years hiding those scars, years carrying the weight of whispers and judgments, but now they were exposed to strangers under the cruelest light. For the first time, she didn't run. She looked Raven straight in the eye. Her voice, though trembling, carried across the bar. "You think you broke me by doing this," she said softly, her words like quiet thunder. "I've been through worse than you can imagine, and I survived every bit of it." The bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked away. Raven, for the first time that anyone could remember, didn't have a response. His smirk had vanished, replaced by something almost like guilt, or maybe fear. Maren turned back to the counter, her hands steadying as she pulled an old flannel from the hook and wrapped it around herself. She should have been shattered, humiliated, but instead she seemed taller, stronger, as though the truth on her skin had given her a strange kind of power. The silence broke when an older man at the bar, a farmer named Gus who'd known her since she was a child, stood up. His voice cracked as he said, "You've got nothing to be ashamed of, Maren. You're the bravest person I've ever seen." Others murmured agreement. One woman wiped away tears. A young man clapped quietly, then louder, until half the bar joined in. It wasn't pity, it was respect. Maren's throat tightened, but she held back tears. For so long she had carried those scars as chains. Now, in this unexpected moment, they had become proof of her strength. But that day didn't just end in applause. Something deeper happened in that bar. People began to see her differently, not as the quiet waitress who blended into the background, but as a survivor, a fighter. Someone who had endured horrors most couldn't imagine and still stood tall. Later, after the bikers left in shame and Raven avoided meeting anyone's eyes, people stayed behind. They wanted to talk to Maren, to tell her she inspired them. A young mother whispered that she, too, carried scars, though hidden in her heart. A retired soldier pressed her hand and said he knew what it meant to live with marks that never faded. For hours, the bar became less about drinks and more about healing. What none of them knew then was Maren's full story. She had grown up in a home that looked picture perfect from the outside, a white fence, a trimmed yard, a smiling family in church on Sundays. But behind closed doors, there was violence, the kind no one ever suspected. She had endured years of cruelty, her body paying the price of secrets she was forced to keep. When she finally escaped at 18, she left with nothing but scars and the will to survive. She built her life from scratch, working shifts, saving pennies, refusing to let the darkness consume her. Her dream wasn't wealth or luxury. She wanted to open a small shelter for women and children who had nowhere else to go. A place where survivors could find safety, warmth, and understanding. That's what she had been saving for. That's what she carried with her every day as she wiped tables and poured coffee. The day Raven ripped her shirt, her secret became public, but it also became something else, a rallying cry. The very next week, people from town began showing up at the bar not just for food, but to drop donations into a jar labeled Maren's Hope. At first, it was small, coins, crumpled bills, but soon it grew. Local businesses contributed. Strangers sent envelopes. A biker who had been there that day returned quietly, leaving a folded check without saying a word. In less than a year, the shelter opened. Painted in bright colors, filled with second-hand furniture and fresh flowers, it became a haven. Maren worked there every day, greeting each person with the same compassion she had always carried. She no longer hid her scars. Sometimes she even showed them willingly, telling women who felt broken, "I've been there too. And if I can stand here now, so can you." Her story spread beyond the town. Newspapers wrote about her. People drove miles to see the shelter. Survivors wrote letters saying her courage gave them strength to finally leave, to finally heal. And while the world applauded, Maren never lost the humility that made her who she was. She always said, "The scars are part of me, but they don't define me. What defines me is what I chose to do after." That bar, once just a place of noise and shadows, became remembered for the moment when one cruel act revealed a greater truth, that even the deepest scars can become symbols of survival, that kindness can grow out of shame, and that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who carry their pain quietly until the day the world finally sees them. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to Kindness Journal. Together, we can keep telling stories that prove compassion is stronger than cruelty. And before we end, I have a special request. Please comment below with the words, "Scars don't define me," to show your support for survivors everywhere.